All right, welcome to our Wednesday live stream, Bible class. We're going to be in 1 Samuel. If you want to grab a Bible, if you're joining us online, we're glad you took the time to be with us this evening, this afternoon, wherever you're at. And we hope someday you'll be able to come down and possibly worship with us and study with us. Like I said, we're doing surveys of the books, and so tonight we're going to start by surveying 1 Samuel, and we're going to go on kind of grouping them together. It's a fascinating, these two historical books have so many things that are packed into them. A lot of times, if you ever look at the way that the books that we have and why we have them and what is it that they're providing to us, I always ask that question. Like the book of Jude. Jude is just a little bit, it's not even a full chapter in some ways, and it's just a few verses. And you look at it and you go, okay, why'd they include that? Why do we have that? And we know by listening to John, at the end of his gospel, he says that, if we were to write everything that Jesus did and said, there wouldn't be enough books. And I'm sure that's true with the Old Testament as well. If there was everything written down that God did and happened to have, that he said and interacted with people, there wouldn't be enough books. You couldn't do it. So I always ask that question, and I think that's a good question to ask when you start to read a book, is to ask why. What's this book's purpose? What's its overall application to us? And the other thing I'm just really getting stronger about this point of view is understanding how to always find a way to why is it important to me, especially the Old Testament. Because too often we look at the Old Testament books and we go, wow, that's great, cool stories, and don't grab that there is an absolute application to what we need to listen to and do, and or something we can pull out of it. So, we take a look at these books, Samuel, now understanding it wasn't written as, Samuel 1 and then sequel Samuel. And the only reason it's in two books now is because it was initially one extremely large scroll. So, our books, we go like this when you say, well, how big's a book, right? And scrolls, they're rolled into two. And so you had to sit and roll these things. And so they were so massive. So that's why they decided it was during the Septuagint period that they divided them up into two. So we have them set up, but they're the same story, and it has the same basic structure of what is being told historically. So we have an important period that's transitioning. We're transitioning. We started out, we looked at the book of Judges, and Judges was a period where God was bringing his people in, fulfilling a promise, and giving them the land, and then they got their inheritance, and then all of a sudden we get to that ugly period of Judges where we see that God had them set up, but they failed to take possession. Some of the tribes failed to take possessions. The other attribute that they had that we saw right away through the period of Judges is this idea of a confederation. They weren't a republic. They weren't a democracy. God did not set them up as a democracy. He set them up as a confederacy of the tribes. So each tribe had their own leadership, united in the covenant. And so following Mosaic law, they had the Levites that were distributed among all those confederation of those tribes, the 12. And so they should have been teaching and providing that, and they should have been worshiping, and then God was their king. That was a governmental structure. Now, in the old law, though, when Moses delivered it to them, we remember that there's a section there when he's giving them the law that all of a sudden he talks about kings. And it's interesting because that's not the way God wanted them set up, but God knew that this time was coming, this time period in Samuel where the people were going to revolt. But they went through that dark period where they were basically, there was no king and every person was doing what they wanted for themselves. So we see that it's going to take us historically at the very beginning of the book from the Judges period into the period where we start to see leadership, a reorganization, a reshaping of these tribes into unified, and then see this leadership. So leadership is one of the things. Now, Remember, we have a king, and he is our Messiah. And that is the ultimate. That is the gold standard, right? The Lord Jesus Christ. And so when we see the way that this structure of Samuel is coming about and bringing forward, and we see the king, we start with King Saul, and then we'll see King David. But even that, we see how the leadership becomes this test of obedience. And that's the challenge. And that really, I think the other thing is there's no leadership like God's, period. If you just follow God, that's it. You can't take human leadership and be able to have the same spiritual righteousness that God can provide in his leadership. Which to me, then when we talk about wanting to reestablish, some people talking about this idea of reestablishing the kingdom in Jerusalem and ruling from there, I'm like, one, show me really a good king that was without blemish, that could lead them and keep the people obedient throughout Judah. David, look what happened at the end of his life. We'll see that in the end of the second book, right? Solomon, no, he didn't do any good. There's very, very few in every one of those kings. So in the profile, as we see this introduction to these kings in Samuel, we see something that God is teaching about the true king that's coming, the Messiah. And it's something that sometimes we don't see because we focus in on the history, but there's a message that's coming out as well. We see how God is going to use prophets to correct the kings. And we see the corruption at the very beginning of some of this, and how that this throne, as he's setting this up, is going to show us and point us beyond just David. And that David is going to end up getting that covenant blessing that's more unique. In other words, through David. So remember, when we start out in the garden, we get a promise from God saying, okay, through your descendant, there's going to be one come and he's going to defeat Satan. And then it gets kind of fuzzy. I mean, we know the promise is there. And then all of a sudden he destroys the world and you go, well, now we got Noah. Oh, okay, well, we know it has to come through Noah because, well, he's like the last family left. But then we don't really hear anything about, well, which one of those sons until we come to who? Abraham. Then now we got Abraham. But we still, as far as being able to focus down, it's not until we get to the tribes and after they're established that we find then the prophets talking about Judah. And it's because David is one that God is going to then choose to come through his. And that's actually in the blessings on the deathbed of Jacob. He insinuates that Judah, right? Judah is like a lion. He talks about, and the scepter will never leave. So there's all these little like nuggets that are like given out, pointing at what God is doing. But it's going to be David that's going to help to bring forward more clarity as far as how the line of Christ is coming. How is this seed coming? Which really, then what you see is Satan doing a dance. I call it the dance, trying to figure out, kind of like on the defense of football, figuring out which way the ball's going because he doesn't know either. And so we see this type of attacks. So the historical setting, we see, again, this moral decline of that era of judges is still going on, and it overlaps it. We see the Philistines are pressuring and threaten Israel, which they shouldn't be, right? They should have been taken care of. They shouldn't be there at all. They're part of Canaanites that should have been removed, and they're the thorn in the side that God said, because you failed to remove them, they're always going to be a thorn in your side. Last time we had them, remember the Philistines and Samson. And so the Philistines are still, they're occupying the coastline, but they're also pushed in, and they've taken some of the cities away from Israel. And we see the center of worship is Shiloh, and worshiping in the tabernacle. And we find quickly in the first part of this book is that they want to be like the other nations. That's true today. There's nations that want to be like other nations. And they want to have that power, prestige, or something. And that is what is interesting about the period of Judges. We see it as so chaotic and everything, but it's almost like God saying, you're going to run the way I want you, but you're going to learn through this disastrous period that really, you're going to seek out something like all the other nations, and all it's going to prove to you is no, you don't. That this world is not the kingdom that can really ever be established in a way that's going to give you the true prosperity without my leadership. So the book begins with Samuel's birth. We will jump right into that. We're going to start. I'm just giving you kind of the overview. And then it records Saul's rise. And then we see the introduction of David as being a future king during the first book, right? And he's not going to become king until toward the very end of it. And then we'll get into, and then it shows, again, we'll see God removing Saul because of his disobedience. So the first two chapters are about Hannah and Samuel and Eli's sons. 3 and 4 is when we find Samuel being called, and we find the fall of Eli's house. And like I said, we're going to dive a little deeper as we go. And by the way, once we start kind of going through those chapters, if you see something, you're coming along, because like I said, I'm doing more of a survey, so you may see something that you go, hey, this happened or something, and I go to overlook, bring it up, because I'm hitting kind of the overview of it. And there's so much. There are so many things. When I read all through this section today, I was going, how do you cover that much, and kind of keep it going? But we're not trying to do verse by verse study per se. But the other significant thing is in chapters 5 and 7. Remember, tonight we're just doing till chapter 10, reviewing of it. We see the capturing of the Ark, and Ebenezer, we'll see him rise up as being appointed. And then Israel, we'll find the last two chapters where they're demanding a king, and then we see Saul being anointed. So let's go ahead and start with, in chapter 1, it starts out describing the situation that is the same type of issue going on with Judges, the time period, that where everyone is doing what they want. And we have this family, Elkanah, and he has 2 wives. And in that relationship, we see that Hannah is barren. The other wife, Peninnah, she has children, and there's a lot of animosity. If you're blessed and you have something, why do you want to pick on somebody who doesn't have it? Why? To me, Peninnah is evil. She's just evil. I mean, why would you do that? You have children, you should have sympathy, right? But it's like she has more, like, oh, I am so much better than you because I can have children. And so, the first thing we see is how she was already tearing herself up, right? About the fact that she could not have children. And Phineas just rubbing it in, she keeps. And so as they prepare, they're preparing to go to Shiloh to worship. And so as she goes there at Shiloh, she earnestly prays. And Eli thinks that she hears her crying, and thinks that she's out of her mind. Thinks it's, or drunk, that she's drunk, and that somehow she's lost her mind and everything. And then, Hannah tells him, no, it's not that. It's just that, I'm petitioning, I'm begging, that I can have a child. And so Eli tells her, next year you're gonna have. And in that, she vows to dedicate her son. I've always looked at that, and when I was young father, I remember that was my prayer. Not to get rid of him, but I mean, to dedicate him. That in a sense, not in the way of taking him off to a temple somewhere, but I think parents should pray that. Is, when you're having children, pray that, Lord, take them. Let them be your servant. Yeah. And now she goes beyond, because she actually takes him right up there, which is the next year when she has him, he's not been weaned yet. So she stays back. But then when he is finally weaned, so how old is he then, you think? When I did some research on that, it could be 3 to 8. So when they say weaned, that means basically they're not using mama, right? They're able to eat. They're not nursing. And there are some moms who nurse even today, kids into like 7 years of age. I don't know what the most extreme, but at minimum, probably 4. Some of the scholars believe that it was around 7 or 8. But he's still a very young boy. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that had to have been hard on him. You imagine, your mom, you're 7 years. How do you understand that? As poor Samuel, what do you mean, Mom? You're leaving me with these guys. And then on top of that, we already know that Eli's boys are not really good men. So how do you think they treated him? You're the little punk, the runt. So, it was very awkward. And then Eli himself, I'm not saying he's a bad man, but obviously he wasn't paying attention to his own boys. And then he gets this boy. But of course, I don't know, because, there's a part where grandpa sometimes are better than they were with his fathers. you know. hmm I think so. That's why I think more the grandfather, that he had lost hope probably in his own boys and saw the zeal that this young man, this young boy, Samuel had. There is something that is set apart about him, that providentially that God is somehow moving this young boy's spirit and the way he serves. And so in about verse 21, we see where Samuel is brought back and given to the Lord. And his name means, y'all remember what it means? His name probably means, they think in the Hebrew, asked of God or heard by God. Yeah, it's in more specific, it was asked of God, or the other was heard by God, which would be answered prayer. So sometimes the names mean a lot. They have a lot of significance in it. So she keeps her vow. Chapter 2 is her prayer. We could spend a beautiful class just going through that chapter. And in it, if you were to evaluate that chapter, you could see her prayer has so many things that it seems inspired. The way that it's worded, everything that she's expressing in here is more than just a mom. There are many things that she glorifies God about in his holiness. Like in verse 2, there is none holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. But there's also shadows of pointing towards this king that's coming. That's the one thing that's hard for sometimes to look at and see these shadows, these little nuggets in these verses where it's bringing out and showing you he's been talking about a Messiah, a king, all the way back, all the way back in history of the Old Testament. But it's through, like even chapter 2 here, where, it comes out, this idea. And we'll see again later where it also, you can see the pointing towards a king of the Messiah himself. So, and the whole thing that we see that God does is how merciful he is to those who are humble. How attentive that the brokenhearted sometimes think God is not attentive to their needs. Yet we see where, like somebody like with Hannah, that she was very much loved and by God. And so, and the proud being humbled. And I think Peninnah, his other wife, was probably pretty humbled. And it's interesting, I think there might have been some jealousy there because Elkanah loved Hannah more than he loved her, Peninnah. And he gave her double portions, right? He would give her when they would go up to the temple. And then in chapter 2, around 12, we see his worthless sons, Eli's worthless sons. And it just straight up says it. Now, the sons of Eli were worthless men. Just They were worthless. Um, and they go through in here in from 13 down for a ways about all the violations through the sacrifices and the way the priests were to get their meat and the way they were corrupting and bribing and threatening people when they would come with their sacrifices. And the people seemed to know more about the way it should be done. And these boys would interject, say, you better give it to me. No, I'm taking this. And so they're total corrupt. But it's more than that because it was also their sexual deviance, sleeping with the temple women. I mean, it was more than just that, the way that they were. And one of the things we read real fast is that Eli failed to restrain them. We were talking about that. What were we saying? We were talking about that. And I remember that's why I kind of bolded it because what were we talking about? The difference between Samuel, because Samuel as well, his boys end up, we'll read about his boys too, right? Eli ends up being killed, dies, his boys are destroyed, and the curse that God puts on his family, that there will be no one grow old. His whole family is going to be wiped out. A judgment that is so, and it's, but we know that Samuel, his boys are also doing some corrupt stuff. But yet we know that Samuel ends up going on to a long service, faithful service with God. So there's something unique, and I think that statement where it says Eli failed to restrain them. Mm-hmm. Seemed to take no action. And look at this is about the leadership again. Remember, we said this whole book is about the corruption of leadership and how God ends up punishing and how important leadership is and the effects that it has on everyone. We saw that with in Judges, the way that the concubine, the Levite roaming, the priest, that he becomes a personal priest to somebody. I mean, it just, so the corruption goes both directions. But one of the great statements is the fact that Samuel grew faithful. He was, man, there's not a lot of teenage boys that remain faithful. It's like you see young boys when they're real young, really nice, easy to get along. But I don't know, maybe it was just mine. But once they started getting testosterone and getting into that puberty range, it's like, oh man, their focus doesn't seem to be spiritual. It seems to be a lot more rambunctious and stuff. So we see a characteristic being described of him as being different in the fact that is faithful. Now, what did he do though? He's from the tribe of Ephraim, so he is not a Levi, so he can't serve as a priest. So there's a lot of the little duties he's doing that I'm sure Eli's sons weren't treating him real well, or the other people, because one, he's not a Levi. But it was kind of interesting what certain functions and things he was doing in this service. And it would be easy for a young man to become resentful. This is not where I belong. I don't belong here. But there's something, again, we see that is beautiful about it. In chapter 3, though, we see where he's established, I guess is the way we describe it. He becomes established and says, now the boy Samuel was, in verse 1, ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Why is it rare? You know what it reminds me of is it's kind of the way the Bible can become, God's word becomes rare in families. How does it become rare in families? It's not read, it's not discussed, and that's how God talks to us today. And so to me, though, in this time period, how was God talking to the people? It was through the prophets. And when God stops talking, you should worry. So that's a declaration of the condition of their moral status as well. And it said there that it was rare in those days and there was no frequent vision. And so now the way that he, that night after he had served, we see that he has this calling, which is a little startling, because he hears a voice and he hears his name being called, but he doesn't know where it's coming from, does he? He's like, so he thinks it's who? He thinks it's Eli. Now, I found this interesting because we talked about that relationship that Eli and probably Samuel had, like a grandfather, and the fact that his boys weren't faithful, but he saw something in this young man. And I think this kind of reveals it when he gets his calling, because where does he go? He goes to Eli. He thinks, oh, you're calling me. And then once after the third time, he figures it out. He's like, no, the Lord is calling you. See, I don't think the Lord's talking to Eli, right? But I think the Lord used to. And so whenever it finally dawns on Eli, it's kind of interesting because he doesn't take it out on the boy. He doesn't ridicule him. You can see that it's like Eli seems to have resolved that I'm not the guy anymore. I'm not getting visions. The Lord's not talking to me. But at the same time, I think he sees in this young boy that the Lord is working something with the spirit in this young boy, because he immediately helps him to understand what's going on. He doesn't go, just go to sleep. Eli's thinking, the Lord is calling this kid now. That's what I mean. I mean, you're 90 years old, because he made it into his 90s. And this young boy comes in and goes, what do you want? Oh, I didn't call you. And he goes back. He comes back in. What do you want? I didn't call you. If you're that old and you're not very spiritual, you just say, just don't come in. I'm not going to call you tonight. I want to get to sleep. So there's something about Eli that he is in tune, that there's something happening. And it's kind of a message, isn't it, to Eli? Because what if Eli, Samuel would have started talking to the Lord and the Lord appeared to him, and Eli never heard anything. Never, he never was getting that. It was like a message to Eli that, guess what? The Lord's now going to be speaking through this boy. So it gives that endorsement in a sense by forcing Eli to see what is happening. And then the third time, that's when the Lord tells him, he calls him. The third time in verse 8. And he tells him, go back. He tells him, no. He tells him, it's the Lord that's calling you, right? So the Lord comes, and that's what's interesting in verse 10. The third time, and then the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times. That's what I mean about the fact that he didn't come in the room. He just had a voice. He was just speaking out loud. And I think that's what that provocation of getting Eli to go, because the third time, then he's there physically. He could have done that the first time. The Lord could have just appeared and, said, okay. And and what's interesting is he tells him everything that's going to happen. He reveals to him that he says, and on that day, he says, behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel, which at which the two ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. That's fascinating, the way it says that. It's going to blow their minds when they hear that. And on that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I had spoken concerning his house from the beginning to the end. And now, you got to go back where God did talk to him, but God didn't talk to him in a good way. It was telling him, basically, you have blasphemed, your boys have blasphemed, you've done nothing about it, and this is a judgment coming upon you, and I'm basically going to take out your family. He's going to destroy him, kill him. And so that's what so apparently the Lord revealed everything to him. And he said, and I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew. I think, Becky, like you said, he knew and did nothing about, right? It didn't say he did anything. You notice that? Mm-hmm. So he had knowledge because it says, he says, for the iniquity that he knew. It didn't say that he did iniquity. It didn't say, but he said because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. It's interesting because Eli, when he did try to speak to his boys, one of the things he told them was, if a man sin, you can be forgiven. But when you sin against God, who intercedes for you? Because what did the priests do? If a man sinned, you could come to the priest and he would intercede between you and God. And they were the ones that should have been doing that for men that were sinning. But it's interesting when he's speaking to his sons, who were priests, he says, but when you sin against God, there's no one to intercede for you. In other words, it's between you and God. There's nobody to defend you. It's like going to court, being charged for a capital crime, and you cannot have legal representation. You're on your own. You can't survive that. And that's what was interesting when he tried to tell his boys that. And it comes back here because that's what he's kind of saying. Now that's what's going to happen. It's between me and you now. And you've done it. So Eli, in the morning, he knows. The Lord probably talked to him. And he brings Samuel in and asks him that question. Samuel's probably, being a young boy that he is, I don't want to tell you. This is one of the most powerful lessons that he's ever going to learn, is that as a man of God that's speaking for God, you preach the word, right? When it's in season or out of season, whether people want to hear it or not. And I think that's one of the first lessons that he learned was, you know what? I got to tell the truth, whether they like it or not. It's what God is saying. And so that was interesting. And he submits to that. He understands that. It's like he says, that, okay. Yeah. Yeah, and so it's a judgment that's coming at the end of 3 and verse 19, and we find Samuel's maturing, and Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. What does that mean? Well, it was true. It was truth. And so I think, because his words now are God's words. And so just think about it. Okay, Eli buys into it. He understands that you are a prophet, but you're just, who are you? And so now when he's going to say things that are really coming from God, how does he prove it to people? This ties into the idea of being able to prove who is a real prophet, if their words are true and what they say comes to happen. And that's what I think it's showing here, is that Samuel was starting to prophesy things, speaking for God, not like a fancy prophet or anything, but he was speaking for God and saying things in which they were true and they were proven, what he was saying. And it became, because from all of Israel to Dan and to Bathsheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And that had to happen, and that couldn't happen in just an instant. That's why there's some time that's going on here that's bringing Samuel onto the stage because he's such a young man. And so over time, it's because God said this judgment's coming. But I think he had to kind of wait and get Samuel in a position because of what happens right after that, that now Samuel's role is going to be even more important. And so we see that that's why his credibility and him prophesying and speaking, and now he's the only one that's receiving things from God. And so that's where we see. And then the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So we see that he is now fully accredited. And then God now in chapter 4 is going to bring about his judgment. And he uses the Philistines, right? That alone is kind of an insult, to be taken out. It's like the way that the Israelites, the 10 northern tribes, were taken out by the Assyrians, that were far worse, that needed a judgment as bad on them, but God used them to take them out. And the Philistines God is going to use. And this is where we start to see, we know they lose the battle, but one of the most disgusting things they do is they try to use the ark. And at first, it scares the Philistines, doesn't it? When they because whenever Phinehas and they decide, well, let's Hopi and Phinehas decide, let's take the ark, as if it's some sort of a weapon, and that's going to be all we need, is like some sort of an ornament, a lucky charm or something that we can take out there, and God's going to, we can't lose if we have the ark. And the people, all the soldiers also, when they see the ark, they fall into it, don't they? They start chanting, they start making a ruckus, probably cheering, and then the Philistines hear it, and they're like, there's a God, their God has come into it. And what's fascinating is, the Philistines never forgot the Israelites' history. Because one of the things that when they hear about this idea is that they think, oh, wow, they're going to do to us like they did to Egypt. But yeah, that they're God. And it's, because in verse 8 it says, woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? They think God is plural. These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage. But then somebody's got the sense to say, take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as what? They have been to you. Because they've been slaves to them, right, in the past. So it doesn't work. The battle is a disaster, and they end up losing the ark, right? They bring it into battle. Hophni and Phinehas die. The ark is taken. It's an embarrassment. A messenger comes running back to Shiloh, and then in that message, Eli just falls back. It's interesting, too. I thought it was interesting because it seems that Eli, he knows they shouldn't have taken it. There's so many things that he knew they shouldn't have done. Because you look in 13, when this messenger arrives, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. He doesn't even know what happened, that they took it. But he knew he was worried about what? The ark of God. So he was waiting for it. And when he heard all the commotion, there's a good word. Hey, I haven't made up a funny word in a while. Commotion. when he hears the commotion, and this is where we find out how old he was, 98 years old in verse 15. But he couldn't see. But when he heard the news, how did it go? And he said, nope, we fled before the Philistines, great defeat. we lost, and your boys are dead. And that he collapsed, falls off, breaks his neck, and dies. And then we see the curse being followed through, even through his daughter-in-law and on what's going to happen. But then what's interesting is what God does. So now think about it. They thought that somehow God was going to have this power to be able to take, and he would use the ark to strike down their enemies. The Philistines captured the ark, and one of the things with their god, Dagon, was they would take their trophies inside the temple where their the idol was of Dagon, and put it before them as kind of like bringing in the one who has lost the battle or something before their God. And yet it doesn't turn out that way, does it? The way that they thought, because they take the ark in before the statue, the idol of Dagon, and in the morning they come in and he's fallen down almost in a position like he's bowing down to the covenant. And that's, so it's God who is working now. The Hebrews, the Israelites are back home, in chaos. God's going to bring his covenant back to his people, and not because they come and get it. It's going to come back to them, right? And all the cities end up suffering these plagues, these tumors, or there's a lot of different discussions on exactly what those were. Now, Dagon, if you go back, it's Dagon, Dagon. But if you go back and trace this god, he is one that goes back to Mesopotamia and is also called, now, Dagon is the Hebrew. The Semitic one that they used in Mesopotamia was Dagan, Dagan. But he goes back to linking to possibly, they think, the father of Baal. So he is looked at, Dagon is looked at as one of the superior gods, the god of nature that created Baal. And sometimes they found it where El, which is another one of those gods with Baal. But Dagon is a very important god of fertility. So, one of the things that these plagues that they believe struck them had a lot to do with fertility, that the suffering that they had also impacted that. And all the cities of the Philistines were struck. And then they want to, it's like playing hot potato, isn't it? The cities decide, we don't want it. So they ship it off to another Philistine city, and then it happens to them, and they're like, we don't want it. They pass it to 4 different cities, right? They pass it around. They're like, and finally they just go, well, what do we got to do? We got to get this thing out of here. And so they build a cart, they put it on some ox. And what's interesting is they're superstitious because they believe if once they turn it loose. Now, before that, they're going to prepare an offering, right? So they prepare mice and whatever these tumors were. I've heard some wild things. Everything from hemorrhoids to something else. I won't bring it up, but it's whatever it was. They formed those into statues of gold, and then the mice, so they were being struck as well with these mice bringing disease and eating food and causing all sorts of problems. And you know what? We know that the plague is spread by mice. So they were suffering quite a bit. So when they return it with this offering, I found it interesting how that they set everything on the cart, put the ark on, and they decide that if the ox carry the cart one direction toward the city, then we know that their gods have accepted it. But if it goes a different direction, then we're in trouble. That it just happened to be. They were in more trouble because then it was just coincidence that all this plague and things were happening to us. And they went the right direction. They went the direction pointing to them that no, it was God, the God of the Israelites, that was inflicting this on them. And one of the things is a message of holiness that we see even as the ark is returned and received by the Israelites. We know that there was a very specific way and who and how you move the ark. And so even the first city that the Israelites received the ark, they end up having men that are killed because of the way that they handled it. So it's not like, woohoo, we got it back now. It's, we have to transport it. I think they didn't do it right. They mishandled it, because then there are people that God strikes in the city because they weren't handling it right. And so the message again is, it's not just a box, that this is still something that is very holy and important. And this is where then we start to see, as we come into chapter 7, that Samuel, because guess what? Eli's gone. Everyone's gone. And now we see the role of Samuel leading Israel back to God. And so it's Samuel who guides them through that process and helps them. And this is where in verse 3 that's, Samuel begins to judge Israel, basically begins to be the main person who's speaking for God. And so he tells them, he says to all the house of Israel, if you're returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away your foreign gods, your Ashtaroths from among you, and direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only. And he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines. Well, that's kind of sad. That tells you another aspect of their spiritual purity, right? So Eli was dealing with the priesthood was permitting and tolerating them worshiping false gods. And so he directs them to gather at Mizpah. And while they're gathered there, so they gathered at Mizpah, and he drew water out and poured it out before the Lord. And they fasted on that day. And they said there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. But the Philistines hear about it. And they think, soft target. We can take them. They took them before. And so they think they can come. But this time, there's a different spiritual condition of the people. Before, the people weren't right with God, and they lost miserably. But this time, they have repented, and they've come back to God. So after that, return, and they're directed to put away those foreign gods. They are then they start to be attacked, basically. That's what we read in verse 7. The Philistines heard about it, and so they come up against them. When they say the Lord's, there were 5 key cities. Remember, they weren't ever really national. It was these 5 cities. So the 5 kings unite together to come up against them when they hear where they're located at. And the people are afraid. Well, they got beat the last time. But Samuel stands up. He said, no, it's the Lord is with us. So he makes a sacrifice of a nursing lamb. And it's kind of interesting as he intercedes for them in verse 12, right in the middle of that interceding, what do we find? The Lord thunders against the Philistines. I don't know what that really means. I couldn't really find. But just imagine, thunder is pretty frightening. If you've ever been in just a thunderstorm, I know there's always lightning, but man, the booms from lightning, from thunder. So I think that maybe some form of like a thunderstorm, something, explosions, natural, that created this fear that shook up the Philistines and caused them to flee, and they were defeated. And it's interesting because they pursue them, they wipe them out, strike them, and then we see in verse 13, the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel, and the hand of the Lord was against the Philistine all the days of Samuel. Which when we get to that point, Samuel's not alive when Saul is killed, when the Philistines come up against them. So this is tying into that idea that they were subdued until that. And then we see the cities that were taken by the Philistines are brought back, restored to Israel. And then the writer says that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. And then it gives a description, he traveled. He had a circuit that he would travel around. But then we're kind of seeing time expand, right? Because now we're seeing time. He's judging, in other words, he's prophesying, he's speaking for God and everything. And then so we find Samuel in his old age. He made his sons judge over Israel. But then again, his sons in verse 3 of chapter 8 did not walk in the ways, but they turned aside. Now this is personal gain. Doesn't go into the detail of all the grievous things that Eli's sons did, but they took bribes, they perverted justice, and this triggers what? Everyone wanting a king. They've had enough. They just went through Eli and Eli's sons, and then they turn around and they see Samuel's sons, and so they want to appoint us a king like all the nations. Samuel's upset with it. Give us a king to judge us. You can't help but take it personal. That it's a rejection of him. But God tells him, no, do it. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as king. And in that demand, one of the things that wanting to be like the nation, God tells them, you need to warn them what it's going to be and what it's going to cost. And he tells them, he's going to take your sons and daughters. He's going to take your land. He's going to take some of your produce. He's going to build his own machinery. It's a taxation, isn't it? It's a taxation that wasn't there. The only thing God took from them when he was their king was their sacrifices. And that whatever he needed to help to, for the Levites to survive. But they're fine with that, right? They're like, okay, no, we want a king still. And this is when we find in 9 where the process of selecting and bringing Saul and introducing him. And it's interesting because he's from, yes. I know, I don't. That's a good, yeah. Well, if you've got sons, you had a wife. But you're right. She's not brought up. Yeah. Well, even Eli. Yeah, even Eli, we don't know about his wife. Where's Mama, right? Yeah, that is interesting. So when he this process is kind of interesting. As he goes through this process it reminds me of the way that God brought out Achan, whenever he brought the tribes through and revealed finally by sorting through the tribes and then narrowing it down, and then all of a sudden we found out it was Achan whenever the sin, when he kept the stuff that was forbidden. He does almost kind of that same process, except now when you come to Benjamin, the one that he's looking for is hiding in the baggage. He's hiding. This anointing, though, is kind of in private, but it's the same process that we see. And Saul prophesies. This is the one time we see where he ends up prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord comes on him. But we see quickly, we're going to see that he's not the right guy. He's one that is. It's kind of like when I've heard about like Lincoln, If President Lincoln was to try to run for president today, the way he looked, no one would vote for him. He was one ugly man. Honestly, I mean, if you look at his pictures, and when cameras came out, I mean, you look at Garfield and you start looking at the other presidents, they start to have kind of a look to them. I mean, even Jefferson, think about it. But there were paintings. But Lincoln, you know, lanky, you know, the way he looked, there's a lot of people, there's that, there, and that's the way we seem to pick our candidates too. How good looking are they? Do they have that look about them, you know, and things like this. So, yeah. And so it's kind of interesting that the way that they want to pick, they pick him the way the world would pick him. And that's a lesson, though. I think God knows exactly he knows what's going on. And he wants to teach them that lesson, that it's what? It's on the inside. And especially, we'll see it next week when he picks David. He's going to bring that lesson up. You picked the last guy by how amazing he looked, because he's described as being basically what? A head above, taller than everybody else. He was so amazing looking and all that. So I think we wrap it up. You know, I think one of the things is about prayer. The prayer of Hannah, the prayers that we need to think about, the importance of them. Religious position doesn't mean you can get away with corruption. You know, the way that Eli's boys were. And we see the impact that it had. And then even with Samuel, his boys triggered the elders to wanting a king. And then by the selection of Saul, we learn that the visible is not something that you can trust in. You know, it's not something you can see. And there's a lot of character flaws that we're going to see in him. It's hard to kind of cover. I know there's a lot of information, but we're just trying to refresh ourselves with that. We'll kind of start in and look at the next chapters. So if you want to read on the next, I think it's the next 10 chapters or so, we're going to find out more about Saul and what he does. And we're going to see a prophecy, a judgment, I should say, not a prophecy, that a judgment that God had said that Moses was to carry out. And it was passed to Joshua, and it didn't happen. And then Samuel's going to be given this command. So think about that. So if you're with us tonight, there's something we can do, prayers or anything, I hope you'll let us know. Well, this coming week, we've got a lot going on with the passing of Terrell Haynes, and our prayers and thoughts are with them. And there's a lot of things going on we're going to talk about after we get offline, but we've got some messages going on, text messages on helping to provide meals and things. So we'll discuss that. But I hope that you'll be able to come back and be with us. If you're online, join us for 9:45 Bible study, 10:45 for worship. And then next week we'll pick up the lesson here. And so until then, God bless.